Hey everyone, Father Lane here. Welcome back to St. Vincent de Paul Regional Seminary, and as it's the summer, I've had a chance to reflect on the last year of teaching and really the 4 years I've been teaching here. And one thing that I see a lot of when I read papers, I see some errors of reasoning, and the purpose of this video is to respond to 3 commonly made mistakes, 3 fallacies that I see especially in papers, but I also hear them sometimes at the pulpit. So we have 3 fallacies I want us to talk about, and the first fallacy is what I'm going to call the etymological fallacy. This, as you can see on your screen, is the false notion that an author's use of 2 words that share a common etymology implies an intended connection between the 2. Let me give an example in English. Consider the following sentence. Upon the prosecutor's motion, the judge, a humble servant of the law not known for courting media attention, nevertheless ordered the millionaire's body exhumed from its grave to search for evidence. In this sentence, you'll notice the word humble and the word exhumed highlighted in green. As you can see, these are 2 different words that share a common etymology. If you look at the origin section on this screen, both words ultimately come from the Latin noun humus, which means ground. That having been said, over the centuries, as Latin became French and as French entered England with the Norman conquest of England, and English developed in the Middle Ages and then in the early modern period, and now to the English that we speak today, via a circuitous path, these 2 English words evolved. It would be an enormous overstretching of credibility to claim that the author of that sentence intends a play on words. If an interpreter were to say the judge is showing solidarity with this body in some way by having it exhumed, we would say, I think you've gone too far. This is an example of the etymological fallacy, assuming that just because 2 words have the same etymology that there's some deep connection between the 2. It's not true in English, and it's no more true in the Bible. As we go to Verbum, one of the things we can do is to search for words with a common root, with a common etymology. Here, consider this word for invited. Here, I'm in John chapter 2, verse 2. This is the wedding at Cana. Suppose I want to do a search on the word invited and its root. I can right-click on it, and you'll see here, normally we would do a Bible word study or a search based on the lemma, which is the specific dictionary form here, a verb, to call or to summon. But I can also do a search on the root. That's this square root icon right here. This will look for any word that shares a root with that word to call or summon. And so I do a search by clicking the word search here, and then I come up to my search bar. And we're going to find that in the New Testament, there's 515 results where we have a word that shares a common root. And sometimes there's going to be a deep connection. Let's take a couple looks at the Gospel of Matthew. As I scroll down here to Matthew chapter 5, verse 9, you'll see some parallels. Here in this beatitude, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. We're going to have similar grammatical forms 10 verses later in verse 19. Whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do so will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever obeys and teaches these commandments will be called greatest in the kingdom of heaven. There's a parallel here, certainly because they're different morphological forms of the same verb, where Jesus is talking about who will be called what in the kingdom of heaven. That's a logical parallel. You can even find others where you might have a noun form or a verb form of the same root. But then there's going to be times where you've got a number of words that have the same etymology, but realistically, we shouldn't connect together. A good example is found down in chapter 18 here in Matthew. In Matthew chapter 18, verse 2, and I can click on it so we can see it, and let me move my search window over here so that way you can see the English. In chapter 18, verse 2, Jesus is going to call a child over and is going to begin speaking to the disciples. Here, the verb is a form of the verb to call near. He called a child over. Pros kalesamenos, that's a participial form of that verb. Then, if we go down to verse 17, a word with a similar root. So here in verse 2, we have a child called over. In verse 17, as we go down, though, we have a different word with the same root, ecclesia, and ecclesias. It's used twice here. This is the common noun for church. So I've got in verse 2 the verb to call over, here in verse 17 the noun church. And they share a common root, and while we can speculate that there's something to be said about the church being called, this noun has its own history. Now, how do I find out about that history? Well, one option I have, just as you saw I used my English dictionary to find the roots of humble and exhume, what I can do with ecclesia is I can go over here to this word church, and I can look it up, as we talked about in our last video. I can first choose the lemma, then I can look it up. Realistically, the best place to look it up would be in the BDAG, but you don't have this in our SVDP license. If I go to the TDNT, which we do have in our SVDP Verbum license, you'll see we have a long entry on the verb kaleo. But if I scroll down, you'll see you've got all these different words that they share a common root, but they've diverged in meaning over time. Ecclesia has its own subsection. The point being, as you read on here, is that the relationship between that verb to call over and the noun church later on in the same chapter, that's a very tenuous connection. It's certainly one that we should not infer too much from. So that is the etymological fallacy. Our second fallacy to avoid is a related one, the usage fallacy. This is the false notion that a word must bear the same meaning in all usages within a given context. And here, once again, is an English example. While getting some exercise in the gym, I was watching the morning news talk show, where the talking heads were discussing the Supreme Court's recent decision expounding on the First Amendment's free exercise clause. Exercise and exercise. If you were to look up that word in an English dictionary, these two meanings, one referring to physical exertion, the second referring to the carrying out of one's rights, one's legal rights, both of those are going to be found as two different definitions in the same entry. But be clear, they don't mean the same precise thing here in this sentence. Despite the fact they're in the same sentence, it does not mean that this word has the same meaning. The same is true in the Bible. If we go, this is a favorite example of mine, if we go to John 13:34, my students from my John class will remember this, we will see this word commandment. And I always want to ask the question here, is this new commandment that Jesus gives a new commandment? That is it different from the Ten Commandments? Is it different from the Old Testament commandments, or is it something entirely different? When I ask students that question in class, they often will say, well, no, the new commandment repeats the Shema from Deuteronomy. Love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And that's when I point out that that is true in the Synoptic Gospels. But John has something different here. John uses this word commandment in a specialized sense. If I do a search, now here I'm going to do a lemma search, so I'm looking at the same word. I'm not looking at related verbs or related adjectives. The word commandments, or commandment, singular or plural, in the Synoptics tends to bear the same meaning that it had in the Old Testament. The commandments here in Matthew 19:17 and parallels refers to the Old Testament commandments. Clearly, in Matthew 5:19, in this context, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments, Jesus is referring to the Old Testament, it bears the same meaning. However, in John, the word commandment is going to have a different meaning. It's going to refer above all else to what the Father gives to the Son. The Father commands the Son to lay down his life. That's how we see it first used here in the Good Shepherd discourse in John 10:18. Indeed, though, in 11:57, the same word, commands, it's plural here, describes what the chief priests and the Pharisees give to others that they should report it so that Jesus might be arrested. Here it's bearing something a little bit of a different meaning. But then later on, in 12:49, the Father commands the Son. Same thing in 12:50. And then in 13:34, the Son bequeaths to his disciples a new commandment. Commandment in John describes the bond of obedience that disciples have for the Son, just as the Son has for the Father. The Son obeys the Father, and the disciple obeys the Son. So there's a difference in meaning. We want to be sensitive to that as we're reading the text. That's how we're going to get a more precise interpretation. And this brings us to exegetical fallacy number 3, what I like to call the temporal fallacy. With this fallacy, we're not talking so much about word study. We're talking instead about using biblical commentaries, or by extension, any other secondary scholarship. Work produced by scholars today, or that's been produced by commentators over time. Sometimes students, and especially preachers, they have a conclusion. They have something they want to preach about. I hear this happening at the pulpit more than anywhere else, but I've also seen it in papers. A preacher or a student, somebody has a claim they want to make, and they go to the research trying to find some reason to support that claim. They're doing the job backwards. They have a claim they want to support rather than reading the text and seeing what conclusions flow from the text. That's always a mistake. But what will happen sometimes is that, say we're working here on the Gospel of John, and a seminarian or a student or a preacher will type the word John in their Verbum license. They'll hit the rank button and they'll see, okay, I've got that commentary by Andrew Lincoln. I've got, that deals with the letters. Here is Raymond Brown's Anchor Bible commentary on John. Over here we have Francis Maloney's commentary on John, and then they could go up here. This is where I keep it. The New Interpreter's Bible, I'll get Gail O'Day's commentary on John. And they look at those different commentaries and they're not giving them what they want. So they might come in here and see what else they have. And they find here, for example, Haydock's Catholic Bible Commentary. And they click on it, and here they see, oh, this commentator says the commandment of mutual love had been previously given, but evidently misconstrued and abridged by the Jews to friends only, to this life only, and for earthly respects. But Jesus Christ reneweth it, and enlargeth it after the form of his own love towards us, and giveth grace to observe it. Here's the problem, though. Your first clue something's amiss is that you've got this, within the commentary, you've got this older form of an English verb. That will make me a little suspicious. When I go to my table of contents, and I scroll down, I see this was published in 1859. Now, just because something is more than a century and a half old does not, by that very fact, make it wrong or unhelpful. But it should provoke some questions. A lot of reasons help to explain why scholarly consensus changes over time, can help to explain why commentaries change what they say over time. And I've got 5 of them up here on the screen. We have new archaeological findings that provide new information about the world or languages of the Bible, new technology that yields more detailed evidence from prior findings, new exegetical methodologies that shed new light on the existing evidence, new scholarly publications that win widespread acceptance, casting prior assumptions into doubt, and especially within the Catholic world, we have new developments in doctrine, and this last one's crucially important. In 1859, scholars usually did not comment within Catholic circles on the original Greek or Hebrew. They commented rather on the Latin translation. It wasn't until Providentissimus Deus in 1893, and certainly, especially, until Divino Afflante Spiritu in 1943, that Catholic scholars were commanded to comment especially on the original language text. Moreover, our knowledge of biblical Greek has changed significantly over 150 years. Having searchable databases makes this task a lot easier. It's not the commentator from 1859's fault that he doesn't have that. It's just that his conclusions are going to be quite limited compared to what a writer a century and a half later has to say. It's very important, therefore, when making claims, and this especially comes up in papers, to explain why should I go with what this author says. Just because you found it in a published commentary or in some other piece of published scholarship does not by that very fact make it true. Nor does it necessarily mean that this is just as good an opinion as a more recent opinion. We want to weigh the evidence in a reasonable way, and you want to justify the conclusions that you're making. So here are 3 fallacies. Let us avoid them, and in all things, read well and pray well.